Welcome, everyone, to day 2 of our Lyman Maisel Shabbaton. We want to welcome those intrepid souls who made it here through the blizzard of New York. Thank you for coming in person. And of course, we want to welcome all of you who are watching us virtually for today's very important conversation about combating racial hatred and bias. Last night, we heard from the amazing Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who was an expert witness at the trial we'll hear a little bit about today. And today we have 2 amazing panelists that we're going to have a discussion with. And I'm going to introduce one of our co-chairs of the Adult Ed Committee, an important part of our Shabbaton Committee, Jeffrey Silverman, to read their bios.
Thank you. Alan Levine is a senior counsel in the commercial litigation, securities litigation, and white-collar and regulatory practice group of Cooley LLP's litigation department. He has successfully tried numerous civil and criminal cases and appeared in the federal and state courts throughout the country, including the recent case, Sines versus Kessler, which took on organizers of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, to trial. Previously, Alan has served as managing partner of Kronish, Lieb, Wiener, and Hellman, and as a U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. Alan holds degrees from NYU School of Law and the University of Pennsylvania. He has held leadership roles in the American College of Trial Lawyers, the Legal Aid Society, the American Bar Association, and the New York State Bar Association. Outside of his law career, he has served as our own chairman of the board of Park Avenue Synagogue and is the current chairman of the board at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Welcome, Alan. Diane Decosta is an educator, artist, and organizer, originally from Laurel, Maryland, and a graduate of the University of Virginia. As a queer brown Jewish woman, combating systems of oppression and building coalitions amongst marginalized communities is at the center of her work. Diane was a lawn resident at the University of Virginia during the alt-right torch march in 2017 and a witness in the trial against the march organizers. She currently serves as the Liberation Design Lab teacher at the Social Justice School in Washington, D.C., equipping middle school students with the tools and skills to design for a more just world. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
We look forward to a great dialogue.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So I just want to set the stage to remind everybody about the events that occurred that bring us to this dialogue today. In the weekend of August 11th and 12th, 2017, white nationalists from around the country converged on Charlottesville, Virginia, for a Unite the Right rally to protest the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue in downtown Charlottesville. At the end of the rally on the 12th, a woman was dead. A 32-year-old woman died at the hands of one of the protesters who deliberately drove his car into the counter-protesters, killing her and injuring dozens of others. But before the rally on the 12th, on the evening of the 11th, these white supremacists started a torchlight march at the University of Virginia's campus. And Diane was present for that march. So Diane, I want to start with you, if you don't mind. I'd love to have you share a little bit of your background with our community here, and tell us what brought you to be on campus that evening.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. I was just telling a couple other folks, always coming to a synagogue, you're like, what's it going to be like? What's a new synagogue like? But then it's so familiar when you're hearing the melodies and the sounds. But what brought me to the lawn that evening, I was a student at the University of Virginia and was involved in the Hillel. I was the vice president of my class, and being selected to live on the lawn is an honor. It's one of the things that all the students are vying for, one of these 54 historic rooms. And so I moved in that day on August 11th in the morning. I didn't know that I would be greeted by hundreds of neo-Nazis and white nationalists marching with torches, but I found myself there that evening, and I don't love talking about the trauma that is that night, but I do think it was a critical moment in our nation's history, in our Jewish community's history, of just seeing where we're at with how bold and how willing people are to display anti-Semitism very willingly in public.
Great. And Diane, and you grew up Jewish, right?
Yeah, so my mom's side of the family is Jewish. My dad's side of the family is Indian. I kind of grew up in a conservative household of going to shul. I have like a spattering of observances in my family, but yeah, I grew up Jewish, and being Jewish was hard for me to accept as a brown woman growing up. It was one of those things of people would look at me sideways of like, you're Jewish? And then the curly hair made a little bit more sense to them. But yeah, so I was involved with the Hillel, had a lot of Jewish friends growing up too, went to all the services at the high holidays. So it was just like one of those things that I came into my Jewish identity in claiming it proudly as a college student. And then the last year of my college experience was greeted with this.
And so if you don't mind sharing, I know it's a little hard to talk about, but if you don't mind sharing with the folks here and virtually and in person, can you describe the events of that night on campus?
Absolutely. So that night, I thought they were going to come and go at around 9 o'clock. And so I was at a professor's pavilion a couple doors down from my lawn room. So I went back to my lawn room thinking it would be 2 or 3 crazy people who came. But when the time that I was told they would come passed, I just went to bed. I was tired of moving. So I went back to my lawn room. And then I'm in my lawn room, I have like a big t-shirt on, and I'm like putting the sheets on my mattress. Like I literally just moved in to this room. And I hear this like guttural belly chant of like, Jews will not replace us. And that rhythmic guttural chant was like an angry mob. I could not describe it as anything but just like this vicious, guttural, persistent chant. That my body like physically reacted to. So my chest got tight, my ears were ringing. I like ripped my Hamsa necklace off of my body and like my Shema ring. I took it off. I had like a painting that I did of Israeli flags and I like flipped it over. I was just like in kind of panic mode as all of this was going on. And professor's wife, who lived a couple doors down, knocked on the door and said, Diane, 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 come with me. The lawn room that I lived in didn't even have a bathroom. It's a single door, a very small room, and it only goes out to the outside. So there's only one exit, and in front of me was this march of hundreds of people carrying torches. So she brought me with her to her pavilion, a couple doors down on the lawn, and there were just these people marching with these torches right in front of us. And I'm running to her pavilion, and she has a balcony. It's a 2-story house that's a little bit bigger than the lawn room that I was in. And I went to the top of the pavilion and oversaw what looked like a river of flames. It was just a sea of flames coming from the south end of the lawn. They were wrapping around, and you could just see them marching towards the rotunda. And I remember her son was saying, I would be really scared to be Jewish right now. At first, I thought they were saying, you will not replace us. But then I listened closely and I heard, Jews will not replace us. And it was in that moment that I was like, I must call my mother immediately, because it was on the news and it was getting streamed on various platforms. So I called my mother and I was like, just so you know, I'm on the pavilion rooftop. I'm safe for now, but I'm here. Because if she turned on the news and saw, it was literally in my front yard. And then that evening, once the marchers came and went, they were on the other side of the rotunda where that violence occurred around the Jefferson statue. I was just like reeling from that experience. And afterwards, a friend who helped me moved in, he lived in Charlottesville. His family lives in Charlottesville. So he called me and he was like, are you on the lawn right now? And I was like, yes. And he offered for me to stay at his family's home Didn't get much sleep that night, but as I was leaving, I escaped through the back alley of the pavilion, and it just felt so indicative of the histories I've been told of escaping Nazis through back alleys. The UVA grounds and the lawn is a very historic place where there's, brick and very tiny alleyways. So I was escaping through the back alley to get to his family's home. But it was not my favorite thing to experience, and it's taken me kind of many months to be able to really fully process what that event was like.
Thank you for sharing that, Diane. Alan, so we want to hear about the case, but I actually would like to start a little bit personal with you too and ask you what brought you into the case? What drew you to the case? How did you get involved in the case?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Thank you, Rabbi Cosgrove. Several weeks after the events of August 11th and 12th, I was davening on Shabbat at a congregation called the Conservative Synagogue of the Hamptons, sitting next to my dear old friend Robbie Kaplan, who's a lawyer, and she was whispering to me how she was thinking of bringing a case for people that were injured over that weekend. And I said to her, just instinctively, if you do that case, I'd love to do it with you. And she said, really, would you? And I said, yes. She said, would you do the Nazis? And I said, I would love to do the Nazis, meaning cross-examining the Nazis. And she said, good. And within a week, my firm had signed on to be one of pro bono counsel. We were involved in drafting and filing the complaint in October of 2017. And my firm, including me, worked on it and had a delegation on the trial team, and I was part of the trial team trying the case.
Great. Well, thank you for being here and for both of you to share. So, Ellen, can you explain a little bit about the case? So the neo-Nazi who killed the woman, he was charged with murder.
Correct.
So that was the criminal case, and this was a civil case. So can you talk a little bit about what gave rise to the case and what kind of a case it was and the objectives of the case?
Okay. Briefly.
Briefly, very briefly, yes. It's super complicated, so just an overview for everybody to fully understand and be on the same page.
The Unite the Right rally was literally an organized rally of all of the major white nationalist organizations in the country and their leaders. They came, they had this torch march Friday night, they had a permit for a speech rally Saturday morning, which never took place because of the violence that they provoked. And then after the crowds were supposedly dispersed, this fellow, James Field, drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring a number of others. Our case charged the organizers and some of the foot soldiers with a violation of a federal law called the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is a post-Reconstruction statute, and Virginia state hate crime law, and different assault laws on the books of Virginia. And we charged this whole group with a conspiracy to commit racially motivated violence with the intention of depriving Jews and black people and their supporters from exercising their constitutional rights. And it's a civil case, so no one would go to jail for our case. We got a judgment of liability and damages on the state conspiracy hate crime law and all the state assault crime laws, and the jury hung on the conspiracy for the federal violation. The federal and the state conspiracy statutes are, for all intents and purposes, the same conduct, the same individuals, and so that will now be on appeal, and we hope to get that judgment upheld and then collect the damages from the defendants for the injured plaintiffs.
Great. And the collective damages were?
Approximately 26 million, including compensatory damages and punitive damages. And the plaintiffs were 9 people, 7 of whom were injured in and around that car attack, and the others who were injured Friday night and Saturday morning.
And I want to hear a little bit about the trial, and you had some interesting witnesses that you got to examine and cross-examine. But I also want to ask, like Diane, when you talked about just now about how hard it is to talk about the events, you were also a witness at the trial, right?
I was, and what that entailed was essentially direct questioning from Alan, step by step, of what my experience was that night. It was a lot to go through, but at the end of the day, there was no accountability for years of what happened. And living in Charlottesville in the UVA community, the rest of that year was difficult. Like, student groups were protesting and organizing and collaborating around, well, what do we do? And there was just no accountability for the folks who inflicted harm on the entire community. So I was like, as much as I don't love talking about the experience, it was important to me that those who came and terrorized our community got the message that you can't just do that. And to my knowledge, the statute hadn't really been tried that often. And so hearing that this was the opportunity, in my opinion, a textbook case of anti-Semitism, a textbook case of why the law was written, if I could contribute as a Jewish resident of the lawn to say what my experience was, to hold them accountable to that violence, that's why I wanted to be involved and was willing to take the witness stand, ultimately in the same room as neo-Nazis.
Great. So Alan, can you tell us a little bit about the trial and how it felt? And I think an interesting aspect of it is that none of the plaintiffs were Jewish, actually, right? So that's just an interesting twist as well you might want to just talk a little bit about in terms of the trial.
Well, yeah, I mean, just without going into great detail, the statute makes it a violation to commit racially motivated violence against a religious minority or black people and their supporters. And so, these individuals were injured as a product of that racially motivated violence. Diane was a really important witness for us because she actually witnessed the torch march with her own eyes, with her own heart, saw it, felt it. Here you had these white nationalists, 400 or 500 of them, marching literally through UVA's campus, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." They then go up to the top of the rotunda. They come down around the Jefferson statue. There are about 20, 25 young people protecting the statue, if you will, and these hundreds of people come down, are shoving lit torches in their faces, are macing them, which one of them described as gassing the kikes. And so that whole Friday night event was a very significant event in our case. Into the courtroom, we tried the case. It was like any other case. You have lawyers on both sides. We pick a jury. The case was tried before a jury. 2 of the defendants represented themselves. All of the defendants that participated in the trial, some of them didn't, but all of them that did testified. We called as plaintiffs the defendants in our case. So we were actually calling them as our witnesses and, in effect, cross-examining them in our case. And I did a number of those difficult white supremacists.
And how was it cross-examining the white supremacists? And you might want to share some of what they called you as well.
Well, cross-examination of a hostile witness is a hostile experience under any circumstances. When they have the racial animus that they do, avowed anti-Semites, avowed white supremacists, avowed racists, it really felt it was important to me to confront them and to cross-examine them and hold them, as Diane said, accountable for what they said and did. A lot of what they say and do is on the internet, as we learned from Professor Lipstadt last night, or it's in their own chat rooms, or it's said to one another to make them feel good, themselves feel good. Here, they had caused this public confrontation. They wanted a public confrontation. They wanted the violence. We proved that with abundant evidence that their intention was to come to commit violence. And so I wanted to confront that, call it out.
The energy in the room, when they represent themselves, they're in the position of where the lawyers would be sitting, and then they come and get to question me. So I'm getting questioned by a literal neo-Nazi about my experience from their harm. And it was wild to me to feel the energy of their hatred in their questioning. So for example, one of our, lovely defendants had a couple questions for me, but even in his questioning, he said, would you have felt better if we were chanting students against Jewish supremacy? And I was like, to even ask that question, you can't hide your anti-Semitism. It was, their eyeballs don't have a soul behind it. It felt like just staring into a void of empathy or humanity in that courtroom. And I think while I was sitting there getting questioned by this person who has these beliefs about me and people who I love and care about, I was just floored by the gall to ask these questions in a federal courtroom. So for me, I was also watching how the judge was responding to their questions, what they were allowing them to ask, what they were allowing for me to say, because there's this legal balance of being able to, as I've found out, just say the truth of what happened versus just directly answering the question. But when you're asked these absurd questions that are rooted in hate, how do you answer besides saying no, I wouldn't like for anyone to be outside of my room with hundreds of torches, lit flames in front of the place that I live. And so I think feeling their energy and also their questions themselves showed so much about how deeply rooted their hatred is. And that experience, I think, was very telling of how necessary the case was in holding them accountable.
And Alan, so you talked about the verdict, and it was a bit of a mixed victory, a little bit of a mixed verdict. You won some parts and you lost some parts.
We didn't lose. The jury just didn't rule.
Right.
So they hung.
They hung, sorry.
Very different.
Right, yes, sorry. Thank you for the correction. And you talked about the damages. So will the defendants be able to pay those damages? And
if they have the means, they will.
Right.
We'll be able, we're certainly going to try to collect them once the judgment is affirmed by the Court of Appeals. It's likely that this kind of judgment is not dischargeable if they file for personal bankruptcy, because it's the product of an intentional tort that involved violence. We will go collect these judgments, hopefully, for the plaintiffs.
And then what do you think, like, the sort of practical outcome will be for this? And going into the case, like, what was are there reasons behind, like, in addition to bringing these people to trial for hate and, like, all they stand for, were you thinking about sort of a broader picture of the consequences of the case?
I think I only speak for myself as a lawyer and a person. I mean, often in the history of our country, the statute's been on the books since 1867, I think. Usually the government, the Department of Justice, will bring these cases. The Department of Justice in 2017 wasn't bringing this case. So we did. This was, if you will, a Henani moment for the lawyers, particularly, I think, for the Jewish lawyers. We had non-Jewish lawyers put in a lot of work in the case, but it was an opportunity to hold them accountable. And I think making a statement and having a jury affirm the charge that this was, racially motivated violence intended to deprive Jews and blacks and their supporters from enjoying their basic constitutional rights, I think that's a very important statement. I mean, last night, Professor Lipstadt told us, what could we do? She said, be a pest. This was being a legal pest.
Right.
A little more than a pest.
Right.
4 years of work and made them go into a courtroom and explain themselves and defend themselves and let them hear a jury say, no, this wasn't political fight. This was racially motivated violence. This was anti-Semitism at its worst.
I also thought it was mind-boggling in the moment that they were coming to protest a Confederate soldier. They're coming to protect this Robert E. Lee statue that they supposedly care so much about. And I was like, in the moment, I'm hearing you say Jews will not replace us. What does Robert E. Lee have to do with Jewish people? I couldn't tell you, right? The Confederacy, black and white, racial America, like that is what I was told they are coming to protest. And the words that I hear outside my door are Jews will not replace us. And hearing things like blood and soil and all of these chants that are so rooted in anti-Semitism, seeing people with swastikas tattooed to their bodies outside of my door, like that was out of textbooks, out of history books that I'd heard about from family stories that I've read about from history, but to see it play out for the purpose of defending a Confederate statue didn't make much sense to me. And that's where the fourth year that I had at UVA was really drawing the lines of what does it look like when white supremacy, white nationalism uses anti-Semitism as a means to keep this racial balance that white nationalists want, and being able to convince, if this is the antagonist to your story, then we have the perfect archetype of the Jew to be able to blame it on.
And one of the defendants, who I cross-examined, had sent out a tweet a month or two before August 11th, which said, if you want to defend the South and Western democracy from the Jew and his dark-skinned allies, come to Charlottesville, 11-12 August. And I asked him rhetorically, that wasn't a very political rallying cry, was it, Dr. Hill? And of course he said it's all political, but the jury obviously concluded otherwise. You wouldn't be calling people to a political rally about a statue, Confederate general statue, by telling him to protect them from the Jew and black people. So.
And from what I've read, one of the actual practical consequences of the trial is that, and the damages, is that it has actually had the impact of shutting down some of the defendants in terms of that they've, the financial consequences that they've had to sort of shut down. Even obviously it's spread, but it feels like it has had some impact.
Yes. Also, I think that they don't all speak in one voice. This Unite the Right was probably the first and only time they've ever come together to do something. But you know, they concluded that these pretextual rallies intended to draw their political opponents into a fight with rallying cries of anti-Semitic and racist languages isn't really a good way to advertise their cause. And so they stopped these kinds of events. The large groups that were organizing them have kind of stopped them, at least appears to be so.
So I want to ask a question that actually is a little bit of what you were saying, Diane, but also Ellen. So I want to think about, like, is the courtroom the place to fight anti-Semitism? And so I hear you, like, it's about being a pest, right? But what are sort of the pros and cons of using the courtroom to fight anti-Semitism? Is sort of the first part of a two-part question that I'll save the second part for a bit.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's only one place to fight anti-Semitism. So these people were injured. They're injured as a result of conduct that's a textbook violation of the statute. So assuming that you have injured plaintiffs and lawyers that are prepared to fight the good fight, you should use the courtroom for it. It's not the only place, but it is a place.
So was there disappointment that the federal government didn't step in to do some of this?
I'll say that I was interviewed by many state officials, federal officials, in the months and years after to hear my story, and this was the only case that actually was brought to the courtroom. So there were Virginia statutes that were tried, there were, or attempted to be tried, but never taken up by the Attorney General of Virginia at the time. There was a county statute in Albemarle County, also not taken up at the time. When I first got questioned by the FBI, I walked in with a picture of 45 and Jeff Sessions right next to him. And so I'm walking into a federal courtroom, and there's, I guess in courts, I didn't know, there's like a president and the Department of Justice, like, portraits in the lobby. But here I am to talk about anti-Semitism and my experience, where the rhetoric that night from people in those portraits was, you know, good people on both sides. And I remember hearing that. I've never heard the President of the United States address something that was so personal to me. And that statement was mind-boggling to watch that next day, because I was like, good people on both sides. Me and who? Like, I'm confused. So it was just one of those moments where I'm like, it feels like the odds are stacked against you regardless of where you are. And so in the courtroom, I feel like marginalized people, whether it's racial minorities, ethnic minorities, whomever, when you're in that situation of feeling like the odds are stacked against you, is this judge really gonna let them ask me these questions? You can't do anything but let the process play out. And for me, it wasn't that I had much faith in the system. There were many court cases that turned out with verdicts that I didn't agree with in the months prior about racial instances. And so this case I wasn't too hopeful for, frankly. And to see the verdict come out positively was actually pretty surprising, because I didn't think that the court would be able to hold these people accountable from what I've seen in past cases, especially around police brutality. And so I was thinking about, is it even worth it? But I think if you don't try it, or don't try it, LOL, if you don't give it the opportunity to succeed, then you can't say that you don't have faith in the system. So for me, it was a matter of like, I'm gonna do everything I can, and if it proves me wrong, then fine. You know, I will say that the courts let me down once again, but I think that seeing the verdict and seeing it play out in the way that it should and for justice to happen meant a lot to be able to see anti-Semitism be tried for a national case that big.
Right. So which goes to one of the things that I wanted to ask about, which is in some of the places I've read that one of the reasons to bring a case federally as well as statewide is to get national attention. And there's been some criticism that maybe this case didn't get the national attention it should have. That if, because it was about anti-Semitism and not other racial discrimination, that there was maybe not as much national press attention to the case as one might have hoped. Do you guys think that that is true? Did you experience it that way?
I'm really not in a position to react to that. It seemed like the press was covering it. I really wasn't reading the news every day. There certainly has been a fair amount of publicity about the case after the verdict. To me, it is what it is.
I also think time played a factor. It was supposed to be tried, and then the pandemic hit, and then there were a couple things that pushed it back. So I think like national attention just shifted, or people were forgetful, or it wasn't just on the top of people's minds. In the UVA circles, I will say that it meant a lot to the people who were affected. And so every August 11th and 12th, my timeline is always people kind of reflecting and remembering the trauma of those days in the community. So even if it didn't get as much national attention or a national story as some might have hoped, the people who were very affected by it were paying very close attention to the court case. And especially like on Twitter, there were some people who were live tweeting what was happening during the trial. And a lot of my friends, graduates, alumni of the university, were really following closely because it was an event that affected everyone at UVA and in the Charlottesville community. So people were really tapped in, but maybe the country at large had forgotten, but those who were most affected were definitely staying tuned in.
Great. Thank you. So, Alan, I want to ask you sort of go personal a little bit again. So you have a very, very distinguished legal career, U.S. attorney, worked for major law firms, and you have a very distinguished, I'm going to call you a professional Jew. You have a very distinguished Jewish career as former chairman of this illustrious institution, this beautiful synagogue, the Jewish Theological Seminary, where Rabbi Cosgrove and I are alumni. So how did it feel to have like those worlds intersect and collide and be a Jewish attorney on this case trying neo-Nazis? How did it feel like to take the lawyer hat off and like the personal Ellen piece in?
It was very important. I remember, well, you heard the place in which I offered to participate in shul on Shabbat. But the high holidays, just these past high holidays, I was sitting in my seat and Rabbi Cosgrove and Rabbi Zuckerman were talking about the Henani Prayer. And I said to myself, this is your Henani moment, kid. This is what you're doing. It brought, as you say, the two very significant parts of my life in one place at one time. And for the time in the courtroom with the witness, I was all lawyer. But, I wanted to do those cross-examinations. I wanted to make them account.
So I just want to explain what Hineni is that Alan just referenced. So the word Hineni means I am here, I am present. It shows up in our Torah in very significant places, and it also is a major prayer for the high holidays, where it's the tefillah leader, the prayer leader says, I am here, this is my moment to bring my most authentic self, to this community to do what I need to do to lead the people. So Alan, I just wanted to give the full weight of not everybody knows what the word Hineni means, and not everybody knows that the Henani Prayer is a central part of our liturgy for high holidays. So I just wanted to explain that that was the gravitas with which you took that.
Yeah.
Also, having Jewish lawyers felt comforting to me as a Jewish witness, just because I feel like anti-Semitism is so misunderstood by non-Jewish people. Having a Jewish lawyer and lawyer team, there were multiple Jewish lawyers, but also non-Jewish people working on the case, but having Alan as someone who understood what it felt like to have, your chest tighten and hear ringing in your ears and have this visceral personal reaction was just comforting, because otherwise I wouldn't have felt as comfortable to share the extent of that trauma with others.
And Ellen, as a result of your presence in being Jewish and your success in cross-examination, you were the subject of a fair bit of social media. Do you want to share some of the lovely names you were called? I mean, in polite company, but so some of what you had to experience afterwards on social media.
I think they called me Satan. They gave me an A+ for being the most obnoxious. And they had a number of other very nasty things to say, but it's all in a day's work. Mm-hmm. Felt good.
A success, right?
Yes.
And to be called Satan is a success. Great.
I should add that we had Professor Lipstadt as an expert witness, so. We needed to teach the jury what anti-Semitism is. We didn't really need to teach the jury in Virginia what racism was, but we needed to teach them what anti-Semitism was. And as the professor made it clear last night, so much of the rhetoric of anti-Semitism, at least today, is Holocaust-based. And the white nationalists and white supremacist organizations that were the defendants in this case all take their cues from Third Reich literature, from Third Reich symbols, from memes, from chants. One of them, the website is bloodandsoil.org. So we needed to educate the jury what all of that meant. The rabbi at CBI Synagogue in Charlottesville, before the trial started, said to me, Alan, you won't have any trouble explaining to the jury what racism is, but not all of them are necessarily going to be familiar with anti-Semitism. So take your time and teach them what it is. And we had, as you could see last night, the best teacher. And she was terrific. She was so effective that I think the total of seven lawyers maybe asked her 7 minutes worth of questions on cross-examination. When one of them asked her, trying to get her to admit that there are good Holocaust jokes, Professor Lipstadt said something like, "There's no such thing as a good Holocaust joke." He sat down, and that was the end of the cross-examination. So she was terrific. She was terrific.
Was the jury comprised? Were there any Jews on the jury?
Well, we wouldn't know that.
Right.
I think not. We had a jury of 8 whites and 4 blacks.
I know you can't know for sure, but I was just wondering if it sort of in any way.
None of them self-identified.
To self-identified, right. Right.
I think it was also an interesting moment for me as a non-white Jewish person to be able to draw parallels between the hatred and also significant differences in the types of hatred for Black people and for Jewish people. It was an interesting opportunity to show how there's a common enemy of white nationalism and white supremacy, and how white supremacy pits us against each other. whereas we should be collaborating against a common enemy. And so a lot of what I took inspiration from that traumatic instance was in educating folks of marginalized communities that we need to collaborate in order for our collective liberation. It's not something that we can fight for just combating anti-Semitism in a silo. We have to speak out against all types of hate. And I think back to like Tikkun Olam and like our call as Jews to repair the world. And what does that look like as Jewish people? To me, that looks like collaborating with other marginalized groups of folks who experience hate in other forms as well. And so whether it was this trial or any instance that has happened in the last couple years, being able as Jews to show up for other acts of violence, hatred, being able to show up as a Jewish person for a non-Jewish issue was really important to me also to show that we can combat anti-Semitism by also combating other forms of hate. And so if there is racism, anti-Semitism perpetuates. If there is anti-Semitism, racism perpetuates. And so in order to obliterate these types of hate, we have to collaborate, and it is essential for us to see that common thread. Otherwise, we're going to have marginalized communities pitted against each other when white supremacy and white nationalism just thrives while we're fighting here down at the bottom. But if we're here collectively seeing this all for the same thing, those people hate us all, and we have to work together in order for us to collectively experience liberation.
So thank you for saying that, Diane. Do you feel that that message is now being heard in a different way post-trial? It's a question for both of you. Do you feel like now that the trial is over, do you feel that it has opened people's eyes to things that they might not have seen in that way before?
I think and justifiably so, it was a Confederate statue. Justifiably, Black organizers should put that issue on the forefront. But I also think what this trial did was put both forms of hate on a level playing field and allow to show how they feed off of each other to advance the goals of white nationalists. And so I think a lot of what I was trying to do personally with my social relationships, my fourth year of college, trying to bridge these marginalized community groups together and say like, hey, Jewish Student Union, we got to show up for the Black Student Union, and being able to show how we can show up for one another. That was something that I was doing like on a personal level my fourth year, but I think this trial did a really great job of bringing both to the forefront and on equal footing to show how it advances white nationalism and how we need to work together in order to combat it.
Great. Alan, do you have anything to add?
No, that's beautiful.
to that. I'm just
She's a terrific witness.
I could tell, right. And I read your testimony.
It was a pleasure to put her on the witness stand.
Yeah, oh my gosh, and I read your testimony, but you had a line in there that just like actually took my breath away, which was, you referenced and you said it a little bit here, but you were more explicit in your testimony about like how it must have been like for the people with in the Holocaust and like the Nazis actually coming in. It was just so.
Yeah, I never in my lifetime thought I would be running from Nazis. I never in my lifetime thought I would be escaping people with swastika tattoos and lit flames in front of me. I thought that was something I would read about in books and hear about at family gatherings, but not necessarily experience for myself. And also because I come from a mixed family, there are family members who I think would experience anti-Semitism because they look more Jewish, whatever that might have meant. But I thought that, how is it me experiencing this? And why is it that I feel this way so viscerally? And that's where I really understood, like, it is playing out in 2017. I am escaping Nazis in 2017 from my college dorm room. And it's a feeling, I feel like as a Jewish person, it tugs at a very personal, deep-rooted sense of self when you see those types of hate play out. And so it's nothing I never ever thought I would experience, but once I experienced it, I really understood who I am as a Jew based on how that experience made me feel.
Great. So I want to offer up a chance for people here, because you braved the snow, I think I should give you the benefit, the merit of actually asking a couple of questions. We have a mic. Ross, you have a mic? We have a mic. We have a mic, and we have some hands up. So Ross, right there, great. And there's one over there too. So, yep. Go ahead. Yes, I can't. It's hard for me to see the lights. So with the lights, who it is? Yeah.
Thank you. That was fantastic. My question to you, Diane, is what was UVA's response to this whole thing during and after the protest?
Yeah, so what is interesting about the lawn is that it's student leaders. It's students who are the student member of the Board of Visitors, the vice president of the class, the president of the class, the president of the student government. And so we were in these positions to be student leaders and take action and have conversations with administration. And then we're also students who experience this trauma in our place of living. So a lot of my friends, one who served on the Board of Visitors, one who was the president of the class, I was vice president of the class, some black students, some white students, some Jewish students, some non-Jewish students. We were all kind of dealing with it personally, as well as trying to hold the university accountable to doing more. I think in the moment, it was just it was annoying that it was a surprise to them. They were pretty not prepared for the level of the number of people who were there. We were all very disappointed that they even made it to the lawn. Like, the lawn is UVA's campus, UVA's grounds. In our opinion, they should have been stopped from coming to grounds. And I think a lot of students had a lot to say about that. But the university, I don't know why they didn't do much. It was also this challenging position because as a state university, the governor plays some role in the university dealings. And so part of the cases with the state level cases, they couldn't necessarily get involved for whatever reason. But that's a great question, because the answer is they didn't do much, and the students definitely felt that and were asking questions about that and didn't necessarily get answers that we were happy with.
I think there was a question. Yep.
Thank you for all of this. Alan, I wonder if you could fill us in on some of the other key players in this courtroom drama, namely the jury, what was voir dire like, the opposing counsel, what was that like, and what about the background of the judge?
The case is still on appeal, so there's a limit to really what I'd like to answer about all of those. I'll only talk about jury selection, which is a matter of record. There was a very extensive juror questionnaire. So in that questionnaire, jurors were asked to identify their reaction and concerns for discrimination against blacks, discrimination against Jews, discrimination against whites, familiarity with these events, their attitudes about Antifa, about Black Lives Matter. And so we had all of those answers. The judge then asked questions of each of the jurors that we propounded to the judge, and people that had opinions already formed on either side obviously were removed from the panel. So the jury at the end of the day was as I said, eight white people, 4 black people, some from Charlottesville, the town, and some from the neighboring county. They had masks on throughout the trial, so it really wasn't easy to really to see individual juror reactions. You often, as a trial lawyer, can read a jury. You can talk to a juror, even though you can't actually speak with a juror. That whole experience was not available to us. The judge was a very experienced trial judge. We had 2 of the defendants were represented themselves, so they were pro se. They were obviously the most active. They asked the most questions. They spent the most time on their feet. They were asking questions and answering them all at the same time. The judge was very tolerant of that, which is why
I'm here shaking my head.
that's why Diane was saying what she said before, because the two defendants representing themselves spent the most time cross-examining her. The other lawyers, capable lawyers, individual lawyers from around the country, most of them very collegial, and there really wasn't a lot of hostility between our lawyers and the lawyers on the other side. We were 3 law firms. Robbie Kaplan and her law firm, Karen Dunn, who's at Paul Weiss by the time the trial, and my Cooley firm. We had 3 law firms together trying the case. So there was a tense trial environment. You have these people just spewing hate and exhibits, which I just have some of them here, which just the rhetoric, the violent rhetoric, the anti-Semitic rhetoric, the racist rhetoric. It was just unbelievable. One of the lawyers said after defense lawyers that they tried to normalize the atrociousness of the rhetoric to kind of sensitize the jury in a way that it didn't seem as outrageous as it was. But one of the defendants that I cross-examined, now I remember I had to establish racial animus. He had retweeted in the 6 months before the Unite the Right rally, a tweet of another person of 4 pictures of black men in Libya being sold into slavery from 2017. And the defendant who I was examining had retweeted those 4 photographs with his own tweet, "Good for Libya." I used that tweet to establish his racial animus, showing the pictures to the jury. That's the kind of just animosity and hatred that was part of the court record in this case. So it was a lot to confront every day.
We have time for just one last question, unfortunately. Was that, yeah.
First of all, thank you all for your efforts and for being here today. It's been very informative. Diane, I have a question for you. What was it like on the UVA campus during the academic year following this event? What were the comments of the rank and file students that were striking to you, and how did you feel as a student at that time?
Great question. I think in the months following the event, there were 2 groups of students who swiftly forgot and those who didn't. And the ones who didn't were minority students, racial minority students, Jewish students. The ones who swiftly forgot were part of the social normed, dominant group, whatever you want to call it. They weren't personally affected as viscerally as the other group. Within the other group, there was also a division in the sense that Jewish students often weren't collaborating with other minority student organizations, and minority student organizations didn't necessarily always think to the Jewish students as a part of their experience as well. And where I found myself was having friends in both of those 2 groups students who were part of the Minority Rights Council, students who were part of the Black Student Alliance, and then also my friends from Hillel and the Jewish Student Union. And I found myself really leveraging my personal relationships to try to bridge students hurting in this way, students hurting in this way, but not necessarily talking with one another. But I will say that that was a labor that took a lot from me personally, because I felt like I was single-handedly like holding these worlds together, and it was a lot of weight that were driving them apart because of bias, right? I think a lot of Jewish students didn't necessarily always engage with other forms of hatred that other students faced on grounds. And then the students in the Minority Rights Coalition had political opinions about Jewish students that were not favorable, and often drove them away from recognizing anti-Semitism as a valid form of hate. So it was difficult within that realm of the students who cared, but I think that in the months following, people were willing to learn and they were willing to sit down with one another more so than they had in my entire college experience, because those worlds for me were very separate. But I will acknowledge that there was an entire majority group of students who swiftly forgot and continued drinking and partying and studying and doing their thing, just because they had the convenience of being able to.
Do you infer their forgetting as acceptance of those comments?
I don't know. I would just say like they just didn't feel the weight of what we felt.
Great. So I want to close out with some thank yous, some really important thank yous to Joan Lyman, who I think is watching online. Her daughter Lizzie was here earlier, who makes this Shabbaton possible, to our amazing Shabbaton chairs and committee, Nan Rubin, Jeff Silverman, Susan Smirnoff, Nancy Korf, who I saw earlier, Devin Klein, Naomi Grable, Sam, and our great Shabbaton teen co-chairs, Sam Korf and Rachel Eisenhart. There will be a teen program later with Diane Decosta. And I want to close out with a little bit of Torah, which is that this week, I always say like the Torah portion is always the perfect Torah portion for the week that it is. And this week doesn't fail. So this week's Torah portion is Mishpatim, which means rules, laws. And last week we got Revelation, we got our covenant with God, and we got 10 commandments or laws. But any lawyer or any person knows that to live in society 10's not quite enough, that there needs to be a little more for interpersonal relationships to govern how we live together. And this week's Torah portion is the legal code for all of our criminal and our civil laws. In fact, this week's Torah portion gives rise to the biggest set of tractates in the Talmud, what we call the Bavas, which is all the tort law. Tort law is the civil cases that actually are the kinds of cases that Alan and his team brought. The cases that we need because we need protection. Every human needs to be protected. Their rights need to be protected. Their safety needs to be protected, and their integrity and their humanity. And we are all obligated, as Dr. Lipstadt said last night, and Alan sort of, I'm going to say you retweeted her today, we need to speak up. When there's something that is wrong, it's our obligation as Jews and as individuals to speak up, to stand up. And we are so grateful to you and Alan for speaking up, Diane and Alan for speaking up, for standing up, for doing the right thing on behalf of us all. You are an inspiration and a reminder to us to continue to also to fight hatred and bias of all kinds, not just anti-Semitism, wherever we see it. And let's all go forth, chazak, chazak. We all need strength for this fight, and you guys have inspired us. So we're so grateful to you being here and to the work that you've done. So thank you all. Thank you for being here.